And so I would now like to introduce Dr. Peter Murphy. Dr. Murphy is a licensed clinical psychologist in private practice with a background in special education, school counseling, and clinical psychology. For 20 plus years, he has treated children and adults with learning, attention, and mood disorders. He also treats children and adults diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Murphy holds a PhD in psychology from California Graduate Institute and a master's in educational psychology from Loyola Marymount University. And meeting Dr. Murphy, I will tell you, he is the human embodiment of a lifelong prescription for Valium. So on that note, Dr. Murphy.
Well, thank you for coming out tonight, and thank you for having me. Okay. And I was just thinking a little bit about what I'd say tonight, and I thought maybe the best thing to talk about was a little bit of what I have seen and experienced over the past several months with children, adolescents, adults, and families as we've gone through this whole election process. And it's been pretty, many people have been shaken to their core through this process. I mean, somebody earlier just mentioned how much fear a lot of people have. And certainly there's a lot of children experiencing a great deal of fear because they've been exposed to some rhetoric that was, pretty alarming and pretty frightening to all of us as adults. So naturally kids are going to be more overwhelmed by it. But what I've also found, as this process has unfolded, is a lot of people who have experienced trauma in their lives to varying degrees, and there are different degrees of trauma, have really been affected by this election process. It's stirred them up a lot, and many of you might be able to relate to this, in that the experience, the way our brains are hardwired is that if we experience some kind of significant trauma in our lives, our brain is always scanning our environments for any stimulus that resembles past experience. And it activates our brains in preparation for a repeat of some experience or anything similar to it in the past. And so people have been very stirred up. I have found people to be very depressed, both in terms of the campaigns and then ultimately the outcome of the election. Many people have felt not only depressed but very immobilized, feelings of hopelessness, powerlessness. Many of the feelings that people who have been traumatized actually go through. And for many people, when they come in and begin to talk about it, they don't know how to make sense of their experience. For many people, they feel like something's wrong with them for having these feelings, for not being able to move ahead. I've had kids come in and say they've gone to school after the election, but nothing could really be done in the classroom because neither themselves nor the teachers could really function the way they normally do. So one of the things that I think is most critical through this process in trying to not only get mobilized and grow from this is, first of all, being very tolerant of our own experiences and our own reactions to this process. And I don't mean you have to sit there and not do anything about it, but one of the things we have to take out of our experience is judgment. So that if you're having feelings of helplessness, of powerlessness, of depression, of just feeling immobilized, if we judge those feelings and those experiences, it actually intensifies them. So there has to be really a curiosity and openness about ourselves first before we can begin to extend that to somebody else. In open communication, and that's going to be an ongoing process. And then two, acceptance of these feelings and where we are in this situation. One of the things that happens is when we feel powerless or we feel immobilized, it's not that we're going to stay in that state forever. And so, again, the more open and accepting we can be about how we feel, the more quickly we can move through it and actually mobilize. So one of the great things about a group like this is I think it kind of normalizes everybody's current experience, everybody's feelings that they're having at this time. And that helps to settle feelings down, that helps to calm us all, that helps us begin to think about how we can move forward, how we can get mobilized. So continuing to meet like this, continuing to communicate with one another about our experiences, about our feelings, again, helps us to process these things. And that's also very critical if we have children, because our ability to process this experience and kind of learn from it and be able to move ahead in a constructive direction is going to also influence how our kids process this experience. And again, we've all had our sense of security really shaken and jarred through this process. And so the one thing we do share with the other side are feelings of vulnerability. And that's the one thing that that's the common ground for all of us. And so everybody copes with those feelings of vulnerability differently. Some people become enraged, some people get a little more passive or withdrawn. But right now, we're all feeling very, very vulnerable. And we have to understand that that's too where a lot of these people who did vote for Donald Trump, our president-elect, were feeling, during the campaign and after the election. So again, the more comfortable, and it's not easy to be comfortable with feelings of vulnerability, but this is how we're going to grow, is being able to tolerate feelings of vulnerability, really do some self-exploration. I love what Stacy said about being kind of woken up and really not only listening to other people, but also, examining ourselves very carefully and being curious about our own feelings and experiences, because that creates the room to actually provide that for other people. What I'd like to do as I'm talking is just open this up to any questions or comments anybody might have. Yeah.
Well, I want to know if you can tell me, sometimes if I listen to music, I feel happy, I can laugh, maybe joke, but then it's kind of like the cloud comes and my whole body it starts tingling and it just goes down. And is that something that you can do in your brain to stop that physical pain?
Well, one of the things that's really important, first of all, to manage an experience like that, is to understand that that is a response to trauma. That is what trauma does. And it's going to come and go. It's not going to just be, like one day you move past it. It's going to kind of hit you in waves, kind of like ocean waves. And when the tide comes in, you're going to get hit with a big wave of that experience and that feeling. One thing that can help reduce the frequency and intensity of those waves is, first of all, knowing that this is what it is. Okay, there's nothing wrong with me. It's a reaction to a very disturbing event to you. And that whatever you have to do then to kind of move through that experience is going to be helpful, whether it's listening to music or whatever else may help you, whether it's turning to somebody for emotional support to kind of help tolerate that experience, whatever works for you individually. I think one of the keys, though, is understanding that this is trauma, this is what it does to us, and that by being aware of it, we can reduce the frequency and intensity of the experience. Yeah.
I found that I'm a writer, and I found I'm suddenly very blocked, which has never happened before.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, every time I try to approach what I'm working on, it feels superficial and ridiculous. And my brother in New York is having the same problem. So I've actually been sending him some of what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
And it scares me, and I need to get out of it, but I don't know how.
Well, again, one of the things, we can't rush the process through. We can, do our best to understand how we're affected. But what happens is the part of the brain that's activated by trauma actually overrides things like, language and being able to express ourselves in writing. And so I think what makes it worse is that if we're feeling, if we can't kind of access those skills, those things that we need to do, it can actually increase our anxiety. Whereas if we can become a little more accepting and tolerant of the experience, again, I think it allows us to move through the experience a little more efficiently. But naturally, if we're starting to put pressure on ourselves to move through it, our anxiety actually increases. It hinders the process. Yeah.
What does one do if you're feeling so much rage? I'm a victim of emotional and physical excess abuse, and I can't accept it.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, I think what happens, and I think this is what you're describing, is that those past experiences are absolutely going to get activated in this, in this election process and with Donald Trump being elected. And rage is a natural response to that kind of trauma. And one of the things that I think is so critical is having a really safe place to talk that through. Because we have to, put language to that. We have to kind of create different narratives for ourselves about this experience so we can manage ourselves. Because the rage alone, which again is totally understandable and acceptable, you don't want to stay in that kind of a state. You want to be able to move through that so you can use those feelings in a constructive way. So I think having a place to really articulate those feelings, putting language to it, again, understanding that our past traumatic histories are going to get activated in this process is something I've heard a lot for the past several months from people I treat. And again, being aware of that and understanding that seems to help reduce the level of distress they experience through this process. So I'd really encourage you to be sharing that experience with other people who you trust, who can be accepting of that.
I on a lot of places on Facebook, people keep telling me to accept him. That's
Well,
why I had to come to a group tonight.
But here's the thing. Here's the thing I want to say about that. It's one thing to say to accept him. It's another thing to say, because that runs the risk of saying you need to kind of just get over your feelings. Okay? And that's not going to help you. Your feelings about this are your feelings. They're understandable. They're natural under these conditions. And you need the room to work with those feelings. You'll decide whether you want to accept him or not later. But right now, your focus needs to be on helping yourself in dealing with these feelings that you have. Those feelings can't be dismissed. Okay. Yes?
Like many people here, I'm feeling a lot of rage, and every time I turn on the TV or the internet, I see, oh, he's chosen Bolton, or he's chosen Bannon, and it's making me even more angry. And I hear about one of the stances, is it best to be a little unplugged right now from all that, so it doesn't keep feeding the pain?
Yeah, I think it's, again, there's not one exact way to manage the experience, but you have to decide, maybe in your case, it is better to kind of distance yourself a little bit from this, but also continue to connect with people who understand what you're feeling and what you're going through, because that will ultimately help you move through this and feel more empowered in a constructive way to be part of whatever change that needs to take place. But again, I think too, the one thing I really emphasize here is not judging yourself for having whatever feelings you have about it. I think it's natural and appropriate because a lot of the principles that we live by, have been shaken to their core. And so it's such a jarring experience for all of us, not just in the election, but the whole process to becoming elected. It just shook everything that we believe in and we thought this country stood for is shaken. What I liken it to is if I have a child in my practice, let's say, who's been abused, it's like the people, for a child, I always look at it in terms of how strong is the bond between the parent and child. So if there's a strong bond, what it tells me is that that parent has been very responsive to the needs of that child on a fairly consistent basis over time. And if the bond isn't that strong, it tells me too that maybe that child hasn't been able to count on the parent's responsiveness. In an abusive situation, children naturally turn to adults to be cared for, and they want to trust in them. But when they encounter an abusive adult, it like goes against everything that they intuitively know is right, or they should be able to turn to this adult. And here, the person they're supposed to be able to trust could potentially hurt them. And I think in a way, we're kind of all in a situation similar to that. We've had Obama in the White House. We've kind of looked at him, and maybe we've really kind of trusted him, and now that's been shaken. And so again, those feelings of powerlessness is also distinguished between feelings and truth. So we can feel powerless at times, it doesn't mean we are, okay? And so that's another important distinction when we're dealing with his feelings, is not to be defined by them, but just to let them be there, to kind of be curious and accepting of them, and decide how we're going to use them constructively. Yeah.
Holidays are coming up.
Right.
And a lot of us have family who voted for Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been debating, not going to Thanksgiving. But if I do you have any suggestions on how to handle this? Because there could also be some bloating. Thanksgiving here!
Okay. What was the question? She was talking about the fact that the holidays are coming up, Thanksgiving's coming up, there may be time with family. Some family members may have voted for Trump. There might even be some gloating about Trump winning the election, and wanting to know how she should deal with this, whether she should go or not. If she chooses to go, how to deal with it. Well, first of all, I think you have to decide whether or not this is a situation you feel you can tolerate well right now. It's okay to take care of yourself and consider your needs first in this. The second thing is probably try and do your best to stay off this topic as best you can, because it's obviously going to be pretty charged in a lot of households. I would say that if it came up and it really was getting charged, you might have to disengage somehow. You might just have to take some time away. But again, don't be afraid to take care of yourself in this process, because the worst thing too would be to react to it and then feel horrible about yourself later for something you might have said in reaction to it.
It's tricky because I have a son, and he's away at college, he's coming home, he's looking forward to seeing his cousins.
Mhm.
So there's that connection. It's like, do I suck it up and let him hang with his cousins?
Can you?
It depends on how bad it is.
Mm-hmm. And I would say that if it got really bad, you might have to find a way just to kind of remove yourself and take care of yourself.
We have time for like one more question.
Sure, sorry.
We have to get to.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm shaken beyond my core. A few months ago, my family tragedy, my cousin murdered. And we have the people and everything. And so I'm dealing with that, and that's something you just can't deal with.
Mm-hmm.
On top of that, he's a New Yorker, despised Trump.
Mm-hmm.
So everything on his Facebook, his last few days, even the day that he was killed, hated Trump.
Yeah.
So everything reminds me every minute of my husband.
Sure, sure. It's hard to imagine what you're going through. Yeah, absolutely. And the one thing I would say is that it's so important for you to have social support in getting through it. Friends, family, therapeutic support, whatever it is, because our brains are social organs, and we process things in the context of relationships. We can't, this is not stuff we should be processing on our own. So it's so important to have that kind of help.
I have a problem with that because I haven't really said much to anybody. I have a 23-year-old son, and he kind of didn't want it. He just couldn't talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't talk about it with a lot of people. And when you tell someone, it's like, and then you have to handle their shock.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of holding that down till I don't know what.
Yeah.
And,
Well, I'll tell you what, that's it's a very serious and complicated situation. I'm happy to even stick around a little bit after and talk to you about what to do with that, okay? Okay.
thank you.
I don't know about you guys, but I needed that. Yeah? And so much of what he said is the reason that we're here. We are that place, okay? We are that safe place. Harriet, we're here for you, okay? And I'm sure you can reach out to... Thank you. So think about that. We now are our community, and we can lean on each other through these hard times.